It's really a treat to be able to kick off this conference and a chance to talk about a subject that I spend each and every day consumed with. MASS LBP is a brand new company. We were set up just a little over 18 months ago. I sometimes describe it as the unexpected love child of the Ontario Citizens Assembly, which is not something that many people either know about or would expect. But if you recall, several years ago, the Ontario government conducted what was, I think, one of the most impressive experiments in citizen engagement and civic participation when it convened 103 citizens, randomly selected from across the province, to spend almost every second weekend for 9 months gathering here in Toronto and deliberating on behalf of all Ontarians about the future shape of our electoral system. Well, I was a part of that process, as was Jonathan Rose, who happens to be here today, as academic director. And both he and I and many other colleagues would sit down after those sessions and sometimes over a pint, think, there's something really interesting going on here. Maybe there's some principles, there's some methodologies that could be extracted, and maybe we could use some of this to address a much wider range of policy issues and concerns. All right, so normally I go to great length to try and explain what we conventionally understand public consultation to be. However, this autumn, I was really pleased to see that NBC has produced a show called Parks and Recreation. Anyone familiar with Parks and Rec? This is all about working at the kind of coalface of local government, and it has a lot of fun with public consultation. Here's a quick excerpt.
They are the men and women on the front lines for improving their community.
Every month, the Parks Department has a public forum, and they always send me. It's pretty cool, whatever, I don't know, I don't care, but it's an honor.
No one else wants to do it. You go to some sweaty rec center and get yelled at by the public. I hate the public. The public is stupid.
From the people who bring you The Office, Amy Poehler in Parks and Recreation.
Thank you so much for coming. What an amazing turnout.
Thursday, April 9th on NBC.
A little close for comfort, anyone? Sense of recognition? Unfortunately, this is too much for what passes for our everyday practice of public consultation, and yet I think if we do it right, it creates tremendous value, not only for our organizations and the mandates that they're trying to achieve, but actually for the public itself. And so I want to spend my 25 or 30 minutes talking a little bit about a different approach that we can bring to engaging with citizens that we're finding is considerably more effective. Inevitably, because I also come out of a bit of an academic background, you need to define your terms. So I'm always asked, well, can you start by defining engagement? And once we get through that, then I'm asked, well, should we really trust the public? So let's get these two issues immediately out of the way. Except I'm not going to put on my academic cap and define engagement for you. I'm going to let some citizens do it instead. These were 3 workshops which took place over the course of November and December. They met in Kingston, Thunder Bay, and Richmond Hill. And they gave us, I thought, some very complete definitions of what civic engagement really ought to mean, and they did it really within the first 20 minutes of sitting down in the morning. In Kingston, they said community engagement is about getting to know community values, thoughts, demographics, and problems. It's about understanding your, all right, choice of word, customer base, fine, having two-way communication in a transparent and accessible manner. Interestingly, they said it's actually not about technology. Sometimes it gets in the way. Good community engagement needs to be representative of the population. Well, that's a principle that, a wayward political scientist likes. How do we create something that is construed as being genuinely legitimate and representative of the population? And that people need to be treated honestly and respectfully, provided with accessible and understandable information. That's a challenge because most of us in our own organizations don't really understand the documents we put out. How do we expect citizens to be able to grasp stuff quickly and make an informed contribution? So let's do it respectfully and provide it with accessible, understandable information and all the inputs that be treated meaningfully. Thunder Bay, Kristen Shields, where are you? Community engagement should be at the forefront of managing healthcare. Now that is a bold and visionary statement. Imagine if we actually took them at their word and the implications of that. Community engagement should be at the forefront of managing healthcare. I think there's a big rationale for why that could in fact be the case. Feedback mechanisms are needed, which is to say engagement can't just be episodic. It's got to be ongoing. And that the person hearing the message needs to be able to respond, not simply say thank you. but genuinely engage in a conversation. And the community needs to feel ownership and believe in the system. That is, if we're doing community engagement effectively, it should be building public confidence in our institutions as well, because ownership for those institutions becomes shared. Now, having got out of the academic world, I get to use much simpler definitions. And so before we kind of fall down this rabbit hole of words, this is the simplest one. It's one that we can all understand. Eyes lighting up. When people's eyes light up and they make a connection, they're engaged. I'm not sure if it's more complicated than that, but in case you forget what lit up eyes look like, here are some beautiful photos of citizens who've been participating in some of our processes. This is fantastic. This, to me, is what it's actually all about. And good policy making is also a great social experience. It's a cultural experience. Brought a photo of her granddaughter. She's just beautiful. I mean, really. So, like I said, there are a lot of assumptions that are made when we begin designing our activities to engage a public. And we have all these assumptions about what we actually think the public is like. Now, for the past 50 years, social scientists have tried to do something really good for us. They discovered mainframe computers, and they discovered long-distance telephone lines, and they discovered that chances are you pick up the phone just when you're sitting down to dinner. And so they decided that if they called enough people, they could create a representative sample, and that would constitute a mini public. And that would be really helpful for politicians and public officials, because they could just call you rather than have an election, and you could be asked any number of questions. The difficulty with polling, however, is that it has created an impression of the public that I think is fundamentally flawed. It creates the impression that the public is much more divided and much more polarized than it actually is. That's why 52% of people always want one thing and 48% of people always want the other. What this has done, it's given us a view of the public as being polarized, as being uninformed. I mean, I get to go around saying, I don't really care about public opinion that much. I don't care what people think. Now, what I mean by that is I've got all kinds of opinions myself, about all kinds of crazy things. But I'm not necessarily that well informed about many of them. But we don't often create opportunities when we're engaging citizens for them to actually become better informed, to challenge them, not just to tell us what they think, but to use the stuff between their ears to perform what I think is the more interesting democratic act, which is not just to speak out, but which is to try and embody in your own mind the interests of your community. The great privilege of democratic citizenship isn't the vote, it's the chance to represent other people. And so when we're designing public engagement exercises, what we're doing is creating opportunities for people to try and represent to us the interests of their community. And that's a really profound shift when it comes to designing processes like this. So we think the public is polarized, it's uninformed, it's emotional, it's volatile. And my God, if I'm walking into a room like they are in Parks and Rec with those assumptions in my head about what I'm about to encounter, yeah, it's going to be an exercise in risk management, right? I'm going to try and mitigate the situation. I'm going to try and contain it, because it's going to be not only personally threatening, and I'm a soft and tender person, and I don't like all these people yelling at me. And besides which, my organization's already given me my marching orders. I've got a mandate, and I'm really worried about hearing stuff that's going to conflict with that mandate. And then what am I going to do? Well, we start with a different assumption. It might seem a bit kindergarten. I'll admit this. But it also works. We think that people, given the opportunity, they prefer to care about their communities and the next generation than they care about today and themselves. We believe that people are altruistic when they're given the opportunity. We believe that they're actually quite curious, that they may have had bad experiences in school, we all have, but that fundamentally people like to learn. They like to take on new information. If it's presented in a way that is respectful and engaging, isn't threatening, we believe that people are kind to one another. That they're not looking to come to some meeting to get into a verbal fist fight with the next guy in line or the person sitting up at the panel. And what's more, they like to solve problems. And this is perhaps especially Canadian. We don't like talk for talk's sake. We're pragmatic people. We want to know that this is going somewhere and that there's some solutions that can be had. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. And that, I think, is totally fair. And so, we think of our engagement work as always being about opportunities for learning, not just learning for the public, learning for the organization. We're co-learners, and that's what's transformative then about an effective community engagement process. So, to underscore, this is not a public. This is not a public. We need to redefine what the public is. This is the last little bit of theory I'm going to do, and then I want to get into a case study of some of the work we've been doing. I think, we live in a representative democracy, but obviously we know that something's not quite right because voter turnout continues to fall, people's trust and confidence in public institutions continues to decline. We are more skeptical, we are more cynical, and we're certainly a whole lot deferential to public authority. And so the idea of having a representative who is going to speak on your behalf, whether they were directly elected or whether they're a trustee in an organization, has really been undermined. People are less comfortable with the idea of representation. They're prepared to delegate some things, but what they really want to be is recognized. That's what it means when people say, I want to feel heard. They're not saying, I want you to speak for me. They're saying, I want to speak for myself. And that's a big shift. That's a sociological shift. That's a long wave shift. That over the course of 200 years, when you've gone from people being illiterate, immobile, and disconnected from one another to being acutely connected, certainly much better informed and more literate, obviously the mechanisms of governance have got to evolve. And so to illustrate this, we're still prepared to be represented when there's some abstract public interest. But when it's a visceral interest, when we see it as being a personal interest, we want to be recognized by the organizations that are supposed to serve us. So when we're at that end of the axis, which is where most political activity used to be traded, it's about delegated authority, loose accountability. That's where we say the experts do know best, and you can speak for me. At this end, it's retained authority, it's strong accountability, it's I know best and I want to speak for myself. And to illustrate this, to put a couple of dots on the axis here, we're still happy to be represented, but it's largely going to be about technical stuff. The diameter of freshwater intake system, the piping, right? The conduits, the plumbing, that kind of stuff, sure, let the experts take care of it. But boy, if it has something to do at this end with closing my daughter's school, no representative is probably going to do a particularly effective job. It's going to require marshalling a different kind of public process. And yet, many of the big issues that are frustrating our society, that create these intractable and very expensive problems that leave everyone feeling frustrated, they're at this end, they're at the recognizant end. It's about municipal infrastructure, child care issues, social assistance issues, transportation, new schools and hospitals. A lot of the stuff which all of you in this room have some measure of responsibility for. So, as I said, people are no longer illiterate, immobile, and disconnected. People are less deferential, more knowledgeable, and more adamant. And that's the climate in which all of us trying to work to engage citizens or constituencies must operate. We know, I've already alluded to the story about why this is the case. But beyond these broad strokes, the value of public engagement isn't just that times have changed, and so we have to change with the times. It's that there are actually great opportunities here. It's the opportunity to optimize public services. And Canada is so far behind, frankly, a lot of European countries when it comes to working with experts, with the design professions, and with citizens. Check out the work of an organization called Think Public that's doing amazing work with the NHS. The British government's Design Council set up an entire public sector unit which was about working with citizens and design professionals to redescribe, redesign, everything from the emergency department to how people were doing self-managed diabetes care. And it was knocking up big, exponential, game-changing returns by bringing together different competencies. It's about maximizing return on investment, and there's an economic proposition here as well. If you don't do the community engagement thing well, you probably know that it can be very costly in terms of time, because projects get stalled and hung up. In terms of legal fees, because someone goes to the courts as a matter of last resort, right? And you end up fighting a communications war. I also believe that there's a case to be made for strengthening democratic fitness. A lot of people talk about the importance of civic literacy, that if Canadians just knew who the Prime Minister was or who the first Prime Minister was, then we'd all be a better country. And that might well be nice and be true, but I'm more interested, I think it's cart before the horse here. I think people ought to have a sense of personal efficacy and be able to situate themselves in the existing social system and understand broadly how they can make a contribution, how they can have their needs addressed. And by learning that their own personal efficacy and the institutions of the state can work together, that then cultivates an interest in all the political science stuff. So I think by doing effective engagement, you can build the democratic fitness of the society. You know this. A wonderful fellow named John Gaskell's put out a book in the past 2 months that says that citizens who are selected for jury service in the US, as a result of that experience, which is rarely very pleasant, actually become more active and engaged citizens as a result. It's our proximity to government, it's our proximity to institutions, where we have a measure of responsibility and ownership that then cultivates the conditions for further participation and buy-in. And increased legitimacy. You can't take legitimacy of your organizations for granted, even if you've got wonderful letterhead and have been around for 120 years. That changes constantly. So you sustain your legitimacy by making your organization more permeable, by devolving a measure of responsibility, opening the doors and welcoming people in. We did a project in the fall for the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. It was called Engaging with Impact. The ministry certainly does have a appetite for targets and indicators so that it has a sense of what's going on the front line. But they didn't have any way of thinking about something as qualitative and ephemeral as engagement. And they commissioned us to go to, with 3 LINs, who were terrific partners in the Northwest and the Southeast and in Central, to run 3 one-day citizen workshops, to have the citizens describe for us what they felt meaningful engagement might be like, and actually design some of the targets and indicators themselves. This is a little video about it. It's 4 minutes. We learned one big thing from that process. It's that we know people want to say. People are always clamoring about the fact that they don't get to say anything. We also know they're willing to serve, just like all of you here today. And that the problem in terms of developing programs for community engagement isn't that we ask too much of people, it's often that we ask too little. When we asked members of the citizens assembly why they were there, they said because it's real, because there's something on the table. It's not just talk for talk's sake.
How can governments evaluate how they engage citizens? And how can these processes be improved to bring citizens and governments closer together? This question is at the core of Engaging with Impact, an ambitious new MASS LBP project to identify the engagement practices that are most meaningful to citizens and suggest new ways for Ontario's local health integration networks, or LINs, to enhance and track their progress. As part of the project's research program, 3 citizens' workshops on engagement and health were recently held in Kingston, Richmond Hill, and Thunder Bay. Citizens in each region were randomly invited to participate in the workshop. The first half of each day was dedicated to learning about the ins and outs of the healthcare system, as well as the challenges and complications the LINs sometimes face when it comes to engaging with their communities. Experts from Queen's University and the University of Toronto helped everyone to better understand how the system works and were on hand to answer questions.
Well, the problem is, there's no such thing as the public. There's enormous variability in terms of what the needs are in different sectors of the population.
But really pulls those insurances together is that they adhere more or less to the 5 famous principles of the OHA.
Senior executives from each of the LINs did their best to explain how their organizations are working to transform Ontario's healthcare system, delivering better value and making it more responsive to patients.
The GTA in Ontario is really one of the most diverse places on earth. truly believe that this is the fabric of Central Lynn.
We have a population less than 100,000. We have a couple of catastrophic accidents, vector accident of the system. So there's a certain number of people that we need to have to balance that risk.
With the learning phase complete, MASS LBP facilitators guided participants through 3 exercises: to establish a working definition of engagement, devise a series of metrics for evaluating the efficacy of future engagement exercises, and determine priorities for the efforts made by LINs to engage their communities.
Available through print, available via telephone, in person.
Send someone right here to the services center. There's hockey runs, hockey dance, sitting around here for hours watching their kids. Perfect way to engage with them.
Because it's the ultimate responsibility, they allocate the money.
Each afternoon concluded with a plenary discussion where the participants were asked to rank and cluster the work of each group.
Which ones do you think probably belong close together? Go right in.
The final report includes a series of essays which address the task of evaluating engagement in both Canada and the UK. The report also details the process MASS LBP used and the recommendations suggested during each of the 3 workshops. A final section proposes a series of targets and indicators for evaluating engagement. Together, the 3 workshops highlighted the importance of creating a culture of engagement and learning that can help to drive transformation within Ontario's health system. First, it will require LINs to do more to demonstrate that they value public input. Citizens expressed frustration that too often the purpose of an engagement exercise was unclear. They want the LINs to focus on having clarity of purpose so that citizens can better understand what's at stake. They also want well-defined roles so that everyone understands who needs to be in the room and just how much influence they can have. In exchange for their investment, citizens want accountability, outcomes and recommendations made during public meetings and consultations. Lastly, they want the LINs to become more effective at communicating with their community. Specific recommendations and indicators for achieving each of these goals are explained in the accompanying report. Engaging with impact. Targets and indicators for successful community engagement by Ontario's LINs will be released in early February 2009.
I always like to joke that this might be the first Government of Ontario report to have its own trailer. But you can get a copy of the report. I brought a few of them around. They're at the front desk, but you can also download them from our website for free. It's a PDF. It looks a little bit like this. I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the recommendations, but then also how we brought the citizens together and how that is based on a set of principles that we use for all of our work. These actually seem very commonsensical and very straightforward. They elaborated them in much greater detail in the course of the report. These are just a couple of, again, great photos of how the process worked. In the interest of time, I will zip. So there were 14 principles, 26 recommendations, and ultimately 32 indicators. And as Steny Brown said to me, you know, Pete, if we were to do all of this, that would make community engagement the most tracked dimension of our healthcare system. And I'm not sure if we're quite there yet, but many of these can be reduced down to just a handful of major indicators which any organization would want to keep tabs on. This is the scorecard of sorts at the back. There's just a couple I'm going to highlight. That LINs should work to integrate opportunities for engagement and learning into their routine operations, which means simply that it ought not be episodic, that when there's a crisis, that's when we choose to engage. When there's a report, that's when we choose to engage, as though it's something that's kind of cleaved off from the mainline operations of the organization. Develop and implement an integrated community engagement strategy as a supplement to the IHSP. I don't want to get into too much LIN speak for you because I know that's there are a few LINs here, but not all of them. Cultivate a culture of engagement excellence with HSPs, that is, LINs ought to then be working with HSPs, including hospitals, to try and raise everyone's engagement. Gain. Some of the indicators was, is there a dedicated budget for engagement activities? The difficulty is, we've got big legal budgets, we've got usually reasonable communications budgets, but we don't yet have engagement budgets. So, we end up scrimping for some Danishes and maybe the school auditorium and expecting a really great result. Well, if you put the same amount of resources into either your legal staff or your communication staff, the results would probably be as disappointing. Can the LIN demonstrate participation from a diverse and representative community that's appropriate to the demographic profile? Again, this also speaks to, are the people present perceived to be legitimate? When I was working on an ill-fated dissertation, I traveled across the country and I visited about 100 federal constituency offices, not looking to talk to MPs, but because I wanted to speak to the constituency assistants, the people who deal with citizens each and every day. And I finally got to Newfoundland, and the woman there was very candid with me, because I'd say, when was the last time you did some community engagement? She said, when was the last election? And I said, well, come on, surely they seem like very sensible, nice people who genuinely cared about their community. I said, well, why don't you do more? And she said, with that Newfoundland candor, that, is a special export of the region. She said to me, well, boy, you only get out the mad, the bad, and the sad, and why would we want to do that? Right, and yet there's kind of an uncomfortable truth about it, too, because when you do so many of these so-called public consultations, the public that's there doesn't really look and feel and sound like what most people would think the public to be. So then, how do you create a representative group that others will see as being legitimate? We never use it in our material because it's too easily misunderstood, but one of the principles of MASS is, how do you manufacture legitimacy, right? But not like, how do you fake legitimacy? How do you actually get real legitimacy? How do you create democratic legitimacy? Some of the other ideas, LIN should clearly state and disclose the process, objectives, and motivations and anticipated value of their engagement exercises. All this is very common sense, but it would actually challenge the everyday practice, because we're not usually so explicit or transparent. Does LIN staff value public input? Are they using engagement strategies to inform their work, etc.? Flip. Emphasize learning and the range of learning modalities. It doesn't work for everyone just to have a presentation at the front of the room with a PowerPoint or to hear from a panel. There's a vogue in management literature to think about all organizations as learning organizations, but I think if you're to genuinely be an effective learning organization, then you are learning with the public, and that's got to change the way you approach communications and all of your internal documentation. I do want to zip through here because there should be some reason left for you to read the report. Maybe this has been enough of a teaser. As a result, do participants report feeling more likely to address the LIN about their concerns and ideas? A very basic idea. Because I had this successful engagement, I now regard the LIN as an appropriate venue to which I can direct my concerns. Are we tracking our efficacy in all of this? Are we taking any non-proprietary data and putting it up to the web? Provocative idea, especially in healthcare. Does the LIN monitor its reputation as a fair dealer among its stakeholders and its public? Can it supply evidence of this reputation strengthening? Challenging stuff. Now, sorry there. Obviously, okay. Move along. So, ultimately, this was about creating a culture of engagement. We said LINs are health service providers. And I know this is really antithetical and a heretical thing to say, because everyone knows LINs aren't HSPs. Well, if you understand community engagement to itself be a determinant of health, a determinant of social well-being, and one of their chief roles can be to engage communities, then that is the health value that they are providing to their community. That's what creating a culture of engagement is about. We say that citizens are ready and waiting for this stuff. It drives them crazy. They ask for more communications, but what they're really asking for is engagement. To harness public input, emphasize learning, make it real. Don't consult for the sake of consulting. We all have noses. We can smell something that isn't authentic or real, and focus on creating a fit-to-purpose engagement and make it mission critical, because it is. We said the ministry should do a bunch of things. We said the LINs should do a bunch of things as well. But ultimately it comes down to creating this climate of active citizenship and democratic fitness. Now, my friends, hit pause for a second. Normally I have the laptop with me. I want you to move the slider to 1 minute 15 using the trackpad. Oh, go back. I'm going to end up. Up. Forward.
Forward.
Now, use the mouse.
Yeah.
Trackpad. Yeah. Okay, right down here. Minute 15 is about here.
Minute 15.
Oh, sorry, not a minute 15. 11:15.
You want to go to 11:15?
Yeah. What's that? That's 10:50. A little bit more. Perfect. Okay. Turn it up. This is amazing.
Sometimes 2 reasons to do the same thing.
Barry Schwartz talking at the TED conference.
And they make people less likely to do it. I'll just give you one example because time is racing. In Switzerland, back in about 15 years ago, they were trying to decide where to site nuclear waste dumps. There was going to be a national referendum, and some psychologists went around and polled citizens who were very well informed. And they said, would you be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in your community? Astonishingly, 50% of the citizens said yes. They knew it or thought it was dangerous. They thought it would reduce their property values, but it had to go somewhere, and they had responsibilities as citizens. The psychologists asked other people a slightly different question. They said, if we paid you 6 weeks' salary every year, would you be willing to have a nuclear waste dump in your community? 2 reasons. It's my responsibility, and I'm getting paid. Instead of 50% saying yes, 25% said yes. What happens is that the introduction of the incentive gets us so that instead of asking, what is my responsibility, all we ask is, what serves my interests?
Bam. Bam. What serves my interest versus what serves my community? Are we asking people when we engage them what serves their interest or what serves our community's interest? That is the critical distinction, and it makes the magic moment in this stuff. Like I said, we come out of the Citizens Assembly, and we've actually stopped using that as our everyday example. There's a better example actually in the coroner's jury, which is where citizens are randomly selected. They're brought together when there is an unusual or unfortunate death to determine the cause of death and then to provide policy advice to government about what regulations might be changed in order to avoid a similar situation in the future. So it's a totally accepted principle, this idea of bringing citizens together in order to become informed, to deliberate, and provide policy advice. We call these things citizens reference panels because we think that puts the emphasis in the right place. It's not about having a group of citizens that challenges the validity of a board, right? It's not about challenging the legitimacy of elected representatives. It's the fact that those people are very busy dealing with a whole range of issues, and they need to be able to refer one small issue to another group of representatives who can focus just on that and are representative of the community. So if you're trying to put together a pyramid and to see where this fits, you've got the wider community, maybe you've got your website communications, you're consulting with stakeholders and experts, and you're gathering all of this input, and then we hold what's called a civic lottery. And we call it a lottery because we want people to feel good about winning. So we mail out, say, 5,000 letters at a time. They look like this. We're very liberal about our use of the Government of Ontario logo. And it says a special invitation to help shape your healthcare system. We'll see the materials in a moment. And people respond. We typically have a 5% response rate. If we send out 5,000, it means 200 to 250 people will reply and say, I want to give you, 2 or 3 weekends to think about this issue. We've done this in the entire province of BC on something as obscure as biobanks and genomic technology to something as simple as creating a vision statement in the Southeast Limb. And we've had citizens from every conceivable background, every demographic profile, step forward, all age ranges to participate. And then they provide the advice to the board and the management. Typically a panel works like this. We select 24 to 36 of the respondents, randomly balancing for age and gender and geography, so half men, half women, profiled against the census. We develop a learning and orientation phase. We do some citizen-to-citizen consultation. This is when we invite the whole community in. And we step down as facilitators and we put people at round tables. Instead of us sort of running the show, the citizens become the facilitators of the wider audience that's come in. Totally changes the dynamic of the room. Totally changes it. Because there's no longer anyone, you can't point your finger at the person sitting in front of the room anymore, right? Then there are deliberations and recommendations, and we don't strive for consensus, we strive for alignment. That is, okay, what generally is the view on this topic, with lots of room for minority opinions, provide a panel. We say that, again, it's about representation. You're lucky enough to get one of these name tags, but in fact, you're one of 57,000 people, let's say in a community as large as the Central Lynn. We do 36 for the whole population. Your job is to try and represent the other 57,300 people who can't be in the room with you. These are the lottery ballots. They come off the same press that produces Toronto Life. It's a big operation to get these things going. As you can see, the Southeast Lynn's letterhead here. We put these in the mail. We run through right now with the IHSPs. Lynn's have been doing their situational analysis, board workshops, different stakeholder meetings, HSP meetings, and then a citizens reference panel. This is like inverting the Royal Commission model, where typically it's citizens presenting to experts. We invite stakeholders and experts to present to citizens whose job it is to filter that information, sift it and sort it, and present it in a meaningful form then to boards and executive teams who ultimately have the responsibility to ratify those recommendations. So it works for the purposes of strategy. It works for the purposes of connecting with communities and identifying shared values. These are the materials that are contained in these little envelopes. These were some of our members of the Citizens Reference Panel in the Southeast when we did this in February. At the end of it, like I said, the liberal use of the Government of Ontario logo, we produce these certificates at the end. And, we sometimes get a bit hokey. We're not sure how much people are actually going to care about this stuff. And then horribly, we forgot to make certificates for 2 people. And it was a real issue, which was great. They really wanted their certificate. Worse, we sent them a certificate and it broke in the mail, so they're now getting their 3rd run at a certificate. But here they are standing, feeling really proud of it. There's a class photo of it. Now, you're going to immediately look at this and say it's really white and it's a bit old, which, with due respect to the representatives of Southeast Lynn, is actually a fairly accurate demographic composition of the region right now. It wasn't exclusively white, it wasn't exclusively old, but that's that part of the province. And when we are working in Central, the class photo looks like Central, it looks very different. I have a video about this, but I don't have time to show it. You can view it on our website just about that process. Here's what we're learning. Citizens want to be better informed. They have valuable insights to contribute. Participation leads to greater public confidence. And here's what we want to do. We want to take on and resolve more divisive issues. We didn't set up MASS to do the nice stuff and the easy stuff. We set up MASS to deal with the radioactive stuff and to intervene before things get to the front page of local newspapers and into the courts. We did it because we think there are a range of intractable issues in our society, but how do we reconcile clinical services, whether this hospital should stay open or closed? That's the stuff that we think a Citizens Reference Panel model is really effective to address, because it ends up creating a buffer between organizations and the community in which you're able to pick apart these issues and reach some representative, authentic, meaningful recommendations. Right now we're interested in working more with the LINs and the ministry and embedding this culture of engagement in the health system, and increasingly through our think tankery to demonstrate the connection between participation, agency, and health. So that's all the time I've got this morning, but I hope that's a quick survey of some of our work, a different approach, challenging some of the assumptions of what we actually believe the public to be, and hopefully giving you a little bit of hope that there's another way, maybe a better way to go about it. Thank you.